say a word of prayer. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving us this place to come, this time, this dedicated day to worship you, to take a break from the rest of our lives, to learn of you with everything you've provided for us to learn from. We thank you that you're the God of creation, the Lord of the nations. We pray that by your Holy Spirit, our eyes would be enlightened, ears would be opened, that we would speak of the things that we are to speak of today, and that you would guide our understanding. And we ask this all by the invitation and authority of your Son, Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen. Amen. Okay. Let's see. So we have, in recent weeks, a month or so, we began the whole nations, well, we did nations and geography, and we've kind of taken some side expeditions recently on different theological and other aspects that had impact or related to nations. So now we're going to get back on track with a little more geography, tying the nations and geography together. So this early stuff we've done has pretty much been Genesis 1 through 11. It's been kind of the information covered with that. Now we're going to kind of pick up in the Genesis 6 area, 5 or 6, where we see what I might have mentioned in passing, what I kind of call, since we're using this nation language to understand as people, common family of people, I've been thinking of, like I mentioned, we're all the people of Adam. It's just unavoidable. And then because the only one who survived directly, whose line directly survived, was through Seth, basically we're all the children of Seth and the children of Noah, because of how this whole flood worked out, and everybody back there was perished except for 8. Now we have, I was just thinking this morning, when we talk about history is writing. It's things we can read. So that's what we mean when we say history. When we look at archaeology, this is things we find. So we can find cave paintings, bones, pottery, all sorts of things that will certainly tell a story, but it's going to be a general story, not a specific story. It's not going to tell us King so-and-so of these people fought this many, had this many in battle, whatever. It doesn't give us that kind of history, or it doesn't give us history at all. History, we have to have an inscription in a stone, or papyrus is left behind, something with actual writing, which we'll get to. So we've got pretty much from the beginning of Genesis, well, the part we're going to talk about today gets us through the period before writing existed. Now, one thing that can get confusing, writing is invented around 3000 BC, and Moses writes around 1500, 1400 BC. So he's writing 1500 years into this existing, but the things we learn of from him date back quite a ways earlier, but not from his time. And even the earliest writing we have from 3000 BC, there's still a lot of things that happened before that. So we're going to lean on archaeology for these things because of this. And especially the farther you go back, the less we can say, because there's just less information and less that we know about, and it's less familiar to us, so it's harder to put the story together. So we're going to go faster at the beginning and slow down as we run into more information. So the third and last of the children of Adam and Eve mentioned by name in Scripture is Seth, and then we see in Genesis 5 his genealogy, Toledoth, we talked about last week, the children through Seth, ending in Adam in that account. An interesting note, so we've got Noah by name, Shem, Ham, and Japheth by name, and then they have 4 wives. So there's 8 people total on the ark, coming off of the ark. Doesn't say anything about their wives. So, excuse me. Not to get off on any rabbit trails, but there are, when people talk about who different peoples were early on or whatever, keep in mind there's a possibility that these 4 women had some bloodline connection to somebody other than Seth. Maybe not. Maybe they're all Seth, but there's a chance that they came through another line. Does that make sense? So there may be a little more whether it's genetic diversity or history or whatever, through those women that we don't know where they came from. So just a side note that might touch on other topics. It's really not important. But the story is told through Seth's line because, that's how the story is told. That's their tradition. So we get down to them, get down to Noah and his family, and this is now, once they get off the ark, this is now the top level of mankind's family tree. So from now on, everything starts at Noah and his 3 sons as we move on. From here, so I showed this before. Basically, if we say creation is back here at the beginning of Genesis, we have the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. The flood is between somewhere. We're going to talk about kind of in here somewhere, just 100 years before the flood, up to this point. We'll see if we get to that today or not. This earliest part. Now, well, let me say this too. when archaeologists name periods, like with the Iron Age, the Stone Age, the Uruk Period, the Ubaid Period, the earliest, the oldest dated things are dated based on basically the predominant tool they had. So the earliest would be, if you hear the word Paleolithic, we're talking about, this is a Stone Age, is another way of saying Paleolithic. That, generally speaking, is talking about when stones were the most advanced. These were the tools that, if they made a hammer, they used a stone to do it. After that, it's up with the Neolithic, which is just a later period of the Stone Age, and then you get into bronze and copper, the Iron Age, things like that. So that's what those names mean. Broadly speaking, they start by dating by these materials as they're discovered. And they're discovered, as I've said in the past, at different times. So in one, and these here, not that you can read it obviously, but these are all different areas. So the Bronze Age in one, maybe the Levant, is at a different place than the Bronze Age in Egypt, because whether they had different tools or resources available, materials, people with knowledge, whatever. So these things happened at slightly different times in different places. So that is one way of these names that you can't read, is by the material that they use. The other thing they use to name them, the name that's used is material culture, and it doesn't mean material like I just used it, like stone and different metals. What a material culture is what people find. So if people are digging, let's talk about it today. Forget ancient things. I mentioned this a long time ago. If you're digging in the future and you hit a period, you've been digging all these different places and finding, different things, and you hit one area, and what is this? And it's the first time you find plastic in a dig, or the first time you find a crock pot, or a fondue pot, or if you find that, or a certain type of art, a certain type of writing, a certain name being used in the writing that you find, the first time you find this example, a new example of art that seems different from others, tools that seem different from others, materials that they're using that seem different from others, a way of life, like now they're burying their dead in a different way than they did before. When you find something that is unique, and the first time you find it, or the oldest you can date it, this is called, they identify that as a material culture. Does this make sense at all? That you're saying, okay, we now find this is what it was in the plantation south, or this is what it was like in the era of the kings in Egypt, or whatever, the Old Kingdom. When they find that, the place that they find it is usually what gives the name for these specific periods. So, if you're in Tel Ubaid or Tel Uruk, and you find the earliest example, earliest instance of a culture and way of living practices, gods, these sort of things, that's unique, and you haven't seen this before, they'll say, okay, this is the Ubaid period, this is the Samarra period, named after that particular dig site. Is this making sense at all? So the place where they find this thing is the name of that period, and then they'll use that as a marker. if they find that right here, and then later they're digging not too far away, and they find, wait, I remember this. I've seen these markings on pottery before, and I've seen this little deity, almost the exact same thing. Well, they're going to say, okay, well, and if the dating and everything comes back similar, they're going to say, okay, we're going to call this the Ubaid period. This is from that same period. Which is great, except if we were to later find writings from these people or whatever, they would have no clue what you're talking about. Like, they weren't the Ubaid people. They would not know what Samarra is. These are all names that were given much, much, much later. We're just using the name because that's where we found the first instance of them. And later, just to really confuse things, somebody might find, in the future, they might find an earlier instance of that same culture in that area with the same things. So now you've got something that predates the original, the one that's found. That's all I need to say. If you understand that, you don't really have to. But I'm just saying that to tell you, when you hear on a TV, I was going to say the History Channel, but don't watch that. If you hear somebody talk about Iron Age 1 or the Late Uruk Period or whatever, that's what they're talking about. And you can, Google it and you can see what they're talking about, specifically the dates. But the reason they use those names is because we don't know the dates. We'll do different date studies to determine when do we think this began and when did it end. And it's not like they had a meeting and said, we all done with this pottery? Okay, trash it, we got a new style. Are we done with this, God? Let's get a different one. They don't do that. So just like with geography, the time between periods is very, very fuzzy. There really isn't a time that you can just strike a line and say this is the end of a Copper Age done because we found the tin. Okay, we'll call it bronze now. They didn't do that. We do that, and if somebody says it began in 3400 BC and somebody else says, no, it began in 2700 BC, I just go, sure. Because as far as we know, depending on where you are, that could be true. So don't get too hung up on the dates. The reason they use the periods is because that's something we can discuss without getting into arguments about the date. Does that sort of make sense? Not that you need to know, but now you do, because it popped into my head, so you're welcome. So the Samarra period is, back up again. So these here are all these different periods I put on here just to satisfy my curiosity because I want to see how they lined up. The question that I'm not going to answer because nobody can, there's theories that are interesting, but the flood's in here somewhere, and that's beyond the point of our discussion of pinpointing it. However, wherever it was is going to affect how I tell the story. So I'm going to say that the Samarra period was right after the flood. I could be all wet. I didn't mean that. But I don't know. But you have to look at these things and go, what were people doing in this particular period? What gods were they worshiping? What tools were they using? Where were they in the world? Did they seem to be moving or sedentary? What characterized a particular culture? And does it fit? Does it seem like before the flood or after the flood? Does it seem like before Babel or after Babel? So you can, like, if I were to say, I think it happened here, and then I find they've got a bronze sword where I found it, like, nope, I'm 1,000 years wrong. I'm way off. So I am going to say, because I think it's plausible that what's called the Samarra period is after the flood, I'm going to say it that way. I am probably wrong, because the chances to be wrong are much greater than the chances to be right. So go ahead and read and find another one. Somewhere in here, the flood happened. So when we see people moving around and building temples and things, the earliest temples we find, and they're clearly not something that Yahweh would have approved of. Are we looking at early people after leaving the garden? Possibly. Is Cain's descendants? It could be. Are we looking at people after they left the ark that were not either outside of Shem's line or any line, I suppose, that was not faithful to God? They could have been them as well. So if you find a primitive temple that is not Yahwistic, they'll call it, or people that follow the God that would be identified as the God of the Hebrews later, if we find something like that, where does that put it? And so for these early ones, it's either after the garden or after Noah. Does that make sense? Kinda? I'm going to pretend that the ones in the Samarra period are after Noah. So all that, so I can begin. Any questions or thoughts? Hopefully the rest will be less complicated and confusing. So the Samarra period is a name for a period specifically in Mesopotamia. You wouldn't talk about the Samarra period here because that doesn't make any sense. And again, Mesopotamia is generally this area here. So the Samarra period is the earliest known culture, at least as of now, the earliest known culture in Mesopotamia. So when I hear the earliest known culture here, I mean, we got Abraham from here. His hometown was here, Haran. So if the earliest, and other things, you know, Babel was the Tower of Babel was somewhere here, I think here, somewhere in this area at least. So if the first time that we find any evidence of a culture living in Mesopotamia is in here, well, it's certainly after the flood, and probably not too far from Babel. So that's why this makes sense to me, among other reasons. But during this period, societies that I'm going to suggest are descended from Noah, speculating here, are predominantly characterized by nomadic lifestyles. They're moving around. Now, you could be a nomad where you just wander forever and you just never really land. What was more common would be, and this if you read Abraham's story and pay attention to the places, this is more typical. Hebron was kind of his home base, eventually. And you'll see, he goes to Gezer, he goes to Egypt, he goes up to Haran, he goes different places. He goes down to help Lot, and then chases the 5 kings away. And then he's moving with his pasture, his people and his animals, all different areas for years at a time, and then comes back to Hebron. So they usually had a home base, but that doesn't mean they necessarily had a physical building there. So it's hard to place these people definitively, because when you're moving around all the time, the way you do archaeology is you find a garbage dump, or you find the foundation of a building. Well, if you don't make buildings and you don't dump garbage in the same time every day, it makes it very hard to find you. It's like try and find evidence of campers. I mean, you can now if they've just made a mess in the woods near you. But in 1,000 years or more, try and find where campers camped. You're not going to find that. But once they live, and if you're driving through the county, you might see an old, there must have been a house there because I see a really, really old foundation sticking through the grass. Those kind of things stick around behind. So whether they moved around all the time or more likely moved around kind of the home base, they're nomadic people in this period. Some villages did exist with some modest permanent dwellings, but not much. This is very early on, and they didn't do that. People in this period were skilled in basketry. That's when this comes about. You start seeing basket weaving, animal domestication. So they're keeping them as pets and raising them, and not just going out and killing something to eat it, but they actually are raising herds. And this is the earliest significant period of early decorative ceramics. Like they're not just making a pot so they can have something to put chili in or whatever. They're decorating it, they're forming it a certain way, painting it, whatever. That all is indicative of this earliest Samarra period. During the same period, and these periods are centuries at least, but usually 1,000 years or so. So it's quite a range. So it's quite just think from now, if we're to go 500 years back and 500 years in the future, that's a massive range. A lot of technology changes, a lot of everything changes. Building styles. So it's useful to put them in a group like this, but it's also kind of cluttered to put them in a group like this. But it's the best we can do without writing. This is the period when we see the emergence of mud brick. So they start, instead of piling stones or animal bones, sometimes you'll see, things that they can find. Wood, bones, stones, things like that is how they used to build. And then they eventually figured out how to make mud brick. So mud brick comes about in the Samarra period. And this lays the foundation, get it? Of future civilizations. Because if you want to build a defensible civilization, if you want to have a permanent city, all the kind of things that come later, you need to be able to protect it. And like, what is it, the Three Little Pigs, whatever, depending on what your city's made of is going to help determine how defensible it is and how long it's going to last. So this is a big deal that they have mud brick at this time. And then complex civilizations will follow. And especially down here, but throughout the Mesopotamia, but especially down here is where we do see the earliest complex civilizations, and they are built with a whole lot of mud brick. Despite all this, I know it doesn't sound like technology now, but for them this is big technology. This is what was on the news at night. They talked about the mud brick on the TV. This is what they would be. This is the big new thing. So this would be their technological and cultural advancements. But despite all of this, there's little evidence of any significant political power. So there's no indication during this period that there's any sorts of kings, any sorts of organizations. I think brick plays into that, as well as, I mean, if we're just now getting brick, we certainly don't have metal and all this other stuff. So that's one part of it. If you don't have that, you can't build a place to settle down. You're still moving around, and you can't defend it. Also, you can't store money. Think about all the things, I'll get to you in 1 second. All the things, how are you going to pass things down? So if you've got this period that's 1,000 years long, you know, you're getting old, like, here, son, pelts, or shells, or a thing I carved out of wood. I mean, whatever it is, however valuable it is to you, some clothing, textiles, baskets, pottery, whatever you could make then would rot, burn, break, something. They just don't last. So there's really not a way to store value in the way we think of today. So I think that's another reason that civilizations, I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but another reason they didn't really settle down. If you don't settle down, you don't need a king, because you're moving and you're just all kind of on your own as tribes that don't get huge. I mean, maybe hundreds, maybe even 1,000 or two, but not much more than that, because that's just too much to manage, and it just doesn't structure that way. Tony?
That's kind of along the lines of my comment/question. Has there ever been has anybody played with the numbers on how long it would take 8 people to become 100 people to become 1,000 people? Because if you start thinking about conflict and kingdoms, and you think, well, population density has to play into that.
Yep, for sure. And there's, the answer is yes, and a lot of people have done that. And they've come to different conclusions because you're going to have to take a lot of presuppositions into account. So we know we've got 4 pairs. I mean, Noah and his wife are terrifically old at this point, but maybe they still had kids after the ark. 3 pairs for sure. What was the birth rate? Probably more than today, but they can look at different periods from what they find. Currently, how many related families do we find in the record of bones? How many, once there's writing, how many do we find? So they can make guesses as to what birth rate was per family at different periods in time in different places, and all of those things. And then you take into account, were there famines in the area? Those sorts of things that will affect, you're not going to have as many, or you need more kids because you're forming an army, whatever. There's all these different factors, so they plug it all into a model and come up with, this is how many you'd have by X many years. So yes, they have. There's a lot of that out there, but there's quite a range to the estimates and how long it would take to get to a certain number. But yeah, that's all out there. But just be aware, any of the stuff when you read it, I like the things that start out by saying, I want to tell you, I'm a complementarian, reformed, whatever, where they lay out from the beginning, they might say, here are our presuppositions, just so you at least know, even whether you agree or disagree with them. Like, are you a biblical maximalist, or do you think the Bible is fairy tales? That doesn't mean their information isn't useful, but it tells you something you should keep in the back of the mind when you're reading it. So, let's see. So because they can't build places, permanent places, and can't really pass down wealth very well, I think this is part of the reason they just don't grow and don't need to settle to protect things. They just keep moving because that's just what they've done. Once you get metal, as I said way back when, once you get things like this that last and are rare and you can't make on your own, I realize you can mine gold and all this, but it takes a lot of work and it's a limited resource. So once you can have these kind of things, now you can, you could call shells and things like that money, but once you get to something that is more difficult to create and lasts a lot longer, and doesn't deteriorate, all this stuff. All of a sudden, you've got a whole different scenario. You can pass it down to your people. You have something you want to protect. All of a sudden now you can have, well, you need armies to protect that. And you also, if you've got all this going on, you got to fund the army. And if you're going to be a king in charge of all this, then you want to pay for it all. So now you have taxes. All of these things happen as a result of metal. The more things become permanent. There's, like I said, a lot more that goes into it, but that makes sense to me as to how this all built up. The next period in this area is called the Ubaid Period. And in this period, you see a shift from nomadic wandering lifestyle being predominant to the establishment of large-scale permanent dwellings. Not huge. Some of them do become quite large, but initially they don't have to be huge, but they are a decent size because you got brick now, and people settle because, as we've talked about before, once you have brick, or once you have a settlement that you can settle down, now you don't. Beforehand, I have to, I've got to have chickens for eggs, and I've got to have a cow for milk, and I've got to have some of my kids can defend the family, and I've got to have my kids having other kids, and somebody's got to repair clothing and all this stuff. That's all, even Little House on the Prairie kind of thing. That you do, everybody does this. Once you can settle into larger communities and rely on each other, now you can specialize. You don't have to worry about safety as much if you've got a safe dwelling, and there's walls around the city, and the community is going to help protect, because those guys like to protect the city. So you can just make baskets or ceramics or whatever, and then somebody else wants ceramics, they get it from you. So with cities comes specialization, or specialization comes cities, whatever. The two go together. Which one caused the other? Who knows? Does that make sense? These things go together. Once you have cities be founded, you start to get these other things come with it. So according to the biblical narrative, by this time, Noah's descendants would have grown into vast numbers, but they're widely scattered, most likely. Even we see with, this is much later, but like we see with Abraham and Lot, like we need to have different places for our pastors, for our families, because they don't mean for my family of 12. They mean for my family and slaves and the people we use for security, people we picked up along the way, hundreds or thousand people maybe. So they do need to spread out. Right now we're significantly before Abraham, but the same thing applies. They need to be spread out. So they're all spread throughout here. And they're spread out far enough that they're just not bugging each other for the most part, as far as we know. We don't have a history book. But as far as we know, it looks like people kept to themselves and did their own thing, as all these tribes. Because they're all separate, and within their tribes, these settlements that start to form, they start to get their specialization even more, and each one evolves differently. So you get these people, because of they're in a different climate, so they need different kinds of clothing. They're in a different area that's more conducive to raising crops than it is to raising sheep. Whatever, their cultures develop differently because of their environment. So pretty quickly you start to have diverse cultures, even though they're from the same family. The same thing Tony's asking about. In that period when they're expanding, but it's not like way later when the Israelites are in Goshen expanding in the same area. They got massive, but they didn't get very far. This is a lot bigger than Goshen. So you've got all these people who I'm arguing are tribes, large families descended from Noah's kids, and they're scattered around in here, all very different. Some live in the foothills of the mountains, some live along the lush plain, whatever. So we're getting different societies, different types of people, different languages. Well, eventually get different languages. We're different practices. So they're all different because of this. This is the theory of what happens. The other thing you see here in this period is there appears to be evidence of social stratification. That there are people who are, the working class, and then the ruling class, whatever. Because once you start to settle down, you can specialize. And also, once you settle down like this, you're going to have people that are fighting. Okay, well now we need attorneys or whatever, judges. So now that's a different class to settle these things. You have a king, so that comes from a different class. So we start to see this stratification, which really hadn't been before. It had always been just families working together with different roles, to be sure. But now it seems like we're starting to see them separate into classes that perform different purposes, tasks. Still organized by tribes, but they start to come up with these proto-settlements, early cities. There's no clear evidence of significant power like we'll see pretty quickly after this. But at this time, there's not really significant power. You're going to have chieftains or whatever. Wouldn't have been a king, most likely. Somebody is probably in charge, or a few people in charge in these areas. But we're not to city-states and kings yet. We're very close. They're kind of building the foundation, everything you need to where kings and kingdom, or kings and city-states at least, will inevitably arise, because they're just getting more and more complex, and they need more infrastructure to support the complexity. So no significant power evident, because they're not probably fighting with each other a whole lot. They're mostly working on internal concerns and just doing what it takes to run their family tribe. Make sense? Any thoughts, questions, anything else? Okay, that gets us through a few periods there. The next one, depending on how you overlap them and everything, is called the Uruk Period, named after the city Uruk, because that's where the things were found that became definitive of that culture. So the first, and this is the end of the Ubaid period, beginning of the Uruk period, whatever. When Uruk, as far as we know, becomes the first city in history to be known as a true city-state, a city where they have walls around the entire city. This is more than just a tribe. There's no traveling at all. They are done moving. They're all in one place. It's massive. And Uruk was enormous, and this is the first city like that, just huge. And this is, most people look at as the birthplace of urban civilization. So if you want to talk about when did we first have a marketplace, a farm market, town square, a specific part of town where commerce was done, and a specific part of town where people lived, a specific center of worship that people would go to, a gathering place, a cistern, a place to store food, all these organized things that the whole area would share. That's kind of what civilizations, or at least urban civilizations, are defined by, those things. And Uruk is the first one we know of to have that, and it's massive. There's just a lot of stuff there to see, at least in the underground that they found. So in Uruk, now we start to see a whole lot of the societal structures develop. And just for reference, we're what they call the Uruk period, 4,000 to 3,000 BC, maybe as specific as 3,100 BC, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But this Uruk period is roughly 1,000 years, a little bit less, where, Uruk is the one that it's named after, but there's other cities, where Abraham's from, Eridu, Babylon, Susa come much later, but I'm blanking out. There's a handful of other cities out there that are similar, much smaller, but similar to Uruk in these urban distinctives. They got the complex societal structures, social classes, and eventually during this period, the earliest known forms of writing. And as I said some time ago, don't think like you're going to sit down and write a letter with this. This earliest form of writing is somebody going with a piece of wet clay, probably, or something else, but the ones we have are wet clay, because it's hard to do this with stone. You want 100 eggs, and you're grabbing them from the coop, and I'm going, 100 times. And so now I've just marked, here's the receipt. So now you've got a receipt for this transaction. So the earliest writing, proto-writing they would call it, is to track, is for legal and commerce purposes, to track trade. Like I'm going to send my servant with 1,000 sheep But how do you know he's coming with 1,000 sheep? I didn't call you ahead of time to say expect 1,000. I got the sealed thing that's got 1,000 marks on it. And when you get this, you open up the seal, see there's 1,000 marks, count, are there 1,000 sheep? Okay, the servant didn't rip you off. He did what he was supposed to do. This is the earliest form of writing, and it's a legit, I mean, it's real writing. It's communicating a number or something, but they don't open it. It doesn't say, please find and clothe, this should accompany 1,000 sheep, my servant, Jethro brought this to you. Or none of that, because they have no way to record that kind of thing. All they are doing is marking numbers, essentially, tracking transactions. Does that make sense? And that's why they'll call it proto-writing. It's before what we would call writing that can actually communicate ideas. So if you can't communicate ideas, it's not writing, and it doesn't count as contributing to history. And so cuneiform would be one of the earliest forms of this, because they're using clay and making, sticking it in there, and then when it dries out, then they have something that would last. Now they initially would just leave it out to dry, just coincidentally here. They initially leave it out to dry because they discovered I can mark this really easy, and if I change my mind or make a mistake, I can smear it out and keep going. And sometimes they just, like if they're in school, they just keep it like this and then smear it and then do their next class, and then when they go to geography class, they use the same thing. But then they discovered if you leave it out in the sun, it hardens. And then, okay, now you've locked in, we've already made sure this is all correct, leave it out in the sun, and now it's sealed. Well, they didn't discover intentionally, as far as we know, that baking them would make it last even longer. It's supposed that was discovered accidentally, because after a fire, after a city would be sacked or whatever, and they just burn it to the ground, they'd come back and go, holy smokes, how did they make their stuff they're writing so durable? Like, oh, wait, it got burned. Did that have anything to do with it? So they think this is how that practice came about. So they're developing this in the Uruk period in southern Mesopotamia. And during this time, the Uruk, because of its size and their specialization and their location, I mean, back then, the Persian Gulf would have come up farther, so they're not far from the water, and there's trade routes all over. There's a river that gets easy access to the Mediterranean, so they are interconnected like crazy from land, sea, you name it, and it's a massive city. So it's a natural hub for commerce and everything else. So we know of grains. There's grain silos there. We know they had grains, textiles, precious metals were exchanged there. And because of this, just all contributed to their prosperity and eventually their influence. More and more people are coming there. So it is, think in terms of like Rome or whatever, mass society, I guess Jerusalem on a small scale during Jesus' time. It's a hub that everybody knew about. And if you wanted something you didn't have, that's where you go through. You go through the nearest big city, and Uruk was it.
So how big a city are we talking about? Traverse City, Grand Rapids, Chicago?
Yeah.
Any idea?
I think, and I've got it in my notes somewhere, just looking for that. I think 30,000 is a rough number. I'll have to look that up, but I think that sticks in my head, because that's a massive amount for that period.
Yeah.
And remember, they're almost all of them inside a wall. So, and the wall could be, several miles around circumference. So these are not little teeny things that you would just build with your family or whatever. These are pretty massive. And you'll see that same kind of thing later on. You see Nineveh or even Jerusalem, the old city of David, whatever, on different scales. And don't think of like a big rectangular or even a circle. These were meandering walls that followed different natural features or whatever. So, good question. Politically, the Uruk is governed by a priest king, and this is the earliest we see this kind of thing. They've got religious and secular authority among the people, and this lays the groundwork for a theocratic governance style that will come up later on, where you have. Remember, we talked not long ago about how are you a king? Because by divine appointment. So this comes up naturally. The earliest we've seen evidence of it written because of writing. I mean, this may have been before this, but we don't have writing before this period. But we know at this point they had it in Uruk. So in Uruk they've got these priest kings that lead by divine appointment, and they have not only authority over the culture and the people, but also over their interaction with the gods. In Uruk, they've completely finished their transition to settled lifestyle from being nomadic. Certainly there's still, I'm not saying there's no nomadic people at this period, there definitely are, but at least this community has decided to settle down. And as I said, this is surrounded by some other smaller towns and settlements that may not have the same wall structure or be as big as Uruk, but they know, if I camp out around here, even if we're not part of Uruk, if we build a city here, the chances of us getting hurt, being close to some other people who have a defensive system, whatever, we're probably okay. So there'd be other smaller towns around here, and eventually some of them became very large, like these others here. If you look, Genesis 10:10 actually lists Uruk, and depending on translation, it might say Erech, E-R-E-C-H, or it might say U-R-U-K, but it's weird that there's things in the Bible that actually line up with what we find in the ground. The cities that are initially formed, the Uruk and Ashur and Babylon, the cities that we see as being legitimately, by writing and by archaeology, the earliest, the Bible also records them as the early cities. Okay, so, and this is the period where we start to see these cities turn into city-states, where they get their own kings, govern themselves, and trade with others as cities, as trade hubs. And this is laying the foundation for the political and economic relationships that are going to eventually crisscross all of Mesopotamia and beyond. Eventually trade with India and Egypt and all over the place by the different trade routes that get built. But initially, we've got city-states that are building up and spreading and becoming fairly significant. At the end of the Uruk period is something called the Uruk Expansion. And it's at the end of the Uruk period, so they call it the Late Uruk Expansion. Because the Uruk period is about to be done. Nobody sent them a memo, but it is about to be over. This culture that makes Uruk what it is about to be gone. There's signs for sure. But as this happens, if we flip to the Bible for a minute and see in Genesis 11, you've got people from all around the area gathering together to build a tower. I think that's the tower that's in Eridu. So remember, the Uruk period doesn't mean just the city of Uruk. That's just the oldest evidence we have for this culture. By the end of the period, Eridu is a very developed city in its own right. Some people have speculated Uruk was more commerce, legal, whatever, and Eridu was more kind of like a religious capital. But who knows, it's speculation. They're basing it on the structures they find there. But Eridu does have a ziggurat there, part of one. It never got finished, which is interesting. There's also a giant building adjacent to it, kitty corner, that looks like it was a priest's headquarters because they found records there that seemed like people keeping track of offerings or the kind of animals you need, that kind of stuff. They found things that priests would have in this building, and they find this building was around, I think, 1,000 years, centuries, that this building existed. And you can tell by the different styles and materials used that it kept on getting added to over the time. Until one time, that happens to date at the same time they stopped building the tower, they stopped building the temple, the temple, and abandoned it. So this massive building project and this place that had probably hundreds of priests working in it, somebody just said, let's just not come to work anymore on the same day or around the same time. It just stopped in that area, in Eridu, which sounds really, really familiar. And we'll talk about more later about the evidence for it, but if what caused the end of the Uruk period is not what the Bible calls the Tower of Babel, there would have to be something remarkable out there that fits better, because the details that line up are just staggering. And it's at the right time. Coincidentally, this is coincidentally, okay? Writing appears then, and all of a sudden we have hieroglyphics, cuneiform, we have letter alphabets and word alphabets, we have different languages. And people, this is really interesting, that this all happened at the same time, and where they all come from, because it's weird. We don't see development from one to another. They just kind of all came as, that's weird. And the archaeologists and historians kind of look at each other and, that is weird. Like, yeah, I agree. I know a story, though, that might explain some of this if you didn't want to just rule this out before you begin. But they will call this a remarkable phenomenon, that this civilization ended, and it gets better. At the same time, there's a sudden and rapid increase of similar cultures throughout everywhere. And what's even weirder is these places, they're built on virgin soil. So I've talked about tells, and you'll see destruction layers as you go. These other ones that begin around 3200 BC or so, when these cities begin, they're on virgin soil. They're on bedrock. Uruk has got centuries below it. Damascus, centuries. Lots of these old cities, Jericho, you can tell it's been built and overbuilt and reused forever. These other ones that pop out of nowhere, 3200-ish BC, they're on virgin soil. So this is the first time they're there. So they came from somewhere else. And somebody just came and built a big city. It didn't grow. A big city just popped into being. And it popped into being with all the stuff that you can see in the layers develop in other cultures. Writing, pottery, but you have this all just right now. Like, how do you explain this? Historians and archaeologists will tell you it's remarkable. I mean, it's hard to explain. Yeah, you're right. This is a crazy thing to happen at the same time everywhere. And what's even weirder is the things that we see. Like here, think before the internet. People would, like right now, everybody listens to the same music and wears the same unique clothes. But there was a time where you would see somebody and know they are from here. Or they eat that food, they're from there. Or whatever. Just because people are different and regions are different. I don't have that so much now. But these places, whether it's, it could be, I wrote something down somewhere. Yeah, it could be in Egypt. It could be in the Indus Valley, which is today India. It could be on Crete, in an island where the Minoans came from. Elam. The Elamites were people that had built a pretty big nation over here. Wherever you want to go to these different city-states that eventually become nations and just giant areas, they all have the same style of pottery, the same artwork on their pottery, the same sorts of currency. The technology they brought with them was the same. They knew how to write in clay tablets and these kind of things, but they had different languages. That's the unique thing. They all had the technology, but different expressions of the language. All the other cultural stuff, they were not unique. They all look very much like Uruk, the Uruk culture. If you go to the museum in Chicago, I'll think of the name sometime.
Smithsonian?
No, in Chicago it's the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, ISEC. That's what it's called now anyway. It used to be called the Oriental Institute. You can see there, they've got one display because people like to look at it and scratch their heads. Look at this spouted vessel. Look at this artwork. And they'll show vases or different things that were found. This one was found in Crete. This one was found in Egypt. This was found here. Like, look at how similar they are. But they've got them labeled where they came from. That sounds familiar to me. They're just confused. But because this all together is the Late Uruk Expansion, that's why they call it that. At the end of this period, their culture is expanding. And as their culture expands everywhere else, where it came from is killed. So it just doesn't, nobody lives there anymore. That's weird. Like, I mean, New York City influences a lot, LA influences lots of, there's always big cities that do that, but they don't like die when they start to spread their influence. There are a lot of weird things to explain that I think Genesis 11 has something interesting to say about.
He must have had wagons in those days, right?
It's a good question. They say that is the birthplace of the four-wheeled vehicle. That's the first place that they found a four-wheeled, like a wagon. But that's a good question. That's not to say that they couldn't have used wheels in some other way, or we just haven't found them. But that's a bit later, not a ton later, but it's around that time. Yeah. Yeah.
Since we're asking questions, is there evidence of shipbuilding yet? Like, when does that come into records? Archaeology.
It's not in my notes, but I've looked at that a little bit. Yeah, I think it would go back this far.
So would the expansion have gone that way too? Is it following that?
Well, remember we talked about Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. Those are three ancient
I'm
cities.
thinking more of the Persian Gulf because of where Uruk is.
Yeah, so Persian Gulf, not just Persian Gulf, because that's how they would have gotten to India, is down through there.
Okay.
And to get up here, like to Crete and wherever else, they would have come up the river, because they're right on the river. So it makes it super handy to get through there. So yeah, they're certainly using ships, but as far as a date on it, that's a good question. I can't remember. But ships go back a long, long ways. Well, I mean, you got this one. So they knew about big things that could carry stuff. So it was a thing. But yeah, good question. So there's your evidence of shipbuilding beforehand. At least one example. Any other questions, thoughts? Yeah, Todd.
It is really interesting to think theologically sort of what's going on, and in man's heart, of course, too. When you go from this nomadic kind of lifestyle, and obviously we're in a ton of people, to the point of saying, I'm the king. I rule over these people. And, you know, in a nomadic culture, maybe they're patriarchs or something like that. But to say that I rule over these people, and maybe this land, you know, and then especially when you look at how those kings were tied to the divine in some way.
Right.
Whether they themselves were, or they were specifically deemed to be semi-divine by the divine.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
That's a big part.
Yeah, and you're right, it lines right up. And what you're saying about the king being divine is that's either saying, and you can go either way, it's both interesting things to look at. Either this is evidence of, I mean, the how God's little g, evil spirits, whatever, manifested themselves, communicated, whatever, was there actually some sort of communication that people were led this way, or was this just incredible hubris? I mean, either way, it says a whole lot about the condition of man, you're right. Just one quick little thing to close. Because of this dispersion, I already talked about this different civilizations spreading. In Egypt, which is, remember, just basically the lower Nile and the upper Nile, just along the Nile, they've always been separate areas. But in 3100 BC, the first pharaoh ever is named Pharaoh Narmer, and he is in 3100 BC. He comes in out of nowhere. Usually they have a backstory. He's the son of so-and-so, or he's whatever. We don't know anything about this guy. He just shows up and unifies Upper and Lower Egypt. This is unheard of. And an outsider that, I mean, we don't know who he is or why, but just here he's going to do that. So we've got that happening in Egypt. We've got, I already mentioned, in the India, and Minoans, and Elamites, Norte Chico, Peru. I mean, now we're going way, way, way farther. You see the same thing. This is all very interesting and difficult to explain unless you're open to more than just naturalistic explanations. So that gets me to the end of a page where I can remember next time, not next week, probably not next week, right? Is that Easter next week? I think it is. Any other thoughts, questions? All right. Thank you, Lord, for this time to learn more about your word and your world and how they interrelate and how we are part of it. And we thank you for saving us from the spiral that we continue to return to, but that you gave us a way out of through your Son. Thank you for this body that can come together as a family to worship your Son, and on this day set aside for rest and your purposes. And we thank you for this. Ask for your blessing and be with our service this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.